Have you ever made a decision in a split second that you wish you could take back for the rest of your life? Well, let me tell you about the day that changed everything for me. The day when I turned away a shoeless child from the restaurant where I worked, only to discover that nothing is ever as simple as it seems. This is my story told from the depths of my heart, and I need you to hear every single word because it might just change the way you see the world around you. I remember it like it was yesterday, even though months have passed since that fateful evening. The sun was setting over the city, casting long golden shadows across the polished marble floors of Le Chateau, the most exclusive restaurant in downtown where I had worked as a waiter for 3 years. The air conditioning hummed softly, mixing with the gentle clinking of crystal glasses and the murmur of wealthy patrons discussing business deals over expensive wine. I was proud of my position there, proud of the crisp white shirt I wore, the perfectly knotted black tie, the way my shoes gleamed under the chandelier lights. Working at Le Chateau wasn't just a job, it was a statement, a badge of honor that said I had made it in a competitive world, where only the best were good enough. I had fought hard to get this position, gone through 3 rounds of interviews, endured weeks of rigorous training on proper table setting, wine pairing, and the art of invisible service. My manager, Mrs. Patricia Hendricks, was a woman of exacting standards, someone who believed that excellence wasn't an act but a habit, and she had drilled that philosophy into every member of her staff. That evening started like any other. I had just finished serving appetizers to a table of businessmen in expensive suits when I noticed him, a small figure standing at the entrance, barely visible through the frosted glass doors that separated the elegant dining room from the bustling street outside. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me because what I saw didn't make sense in the context of where I was. The maitre d', Robert, a tall man with silver hair and an air of aristocratic disdain, was blocking the entrance with his body, his hand raised in a gesture that clearly said, "Stop." I moved closer, curiosity getting the better of me, and that's when I saw him clearly for the first time. A boy, no more than 8 or 9 years old, with tangled dark hair that hung over his eyes, wearing a torn t-shirt that might have once been white but was now a dingy gray, and shorts that were too big for his small frame, held up by what looked like a piece of rope. But what struck me most, what made my heart skip a beat for reasons I didn't yet understand, was that he had no shoes. His feet were bare, dirty from the city streets, with cuts and bruises visible even from where I stood. The contrast between his appearance and the opulent surroundings of Le Chateau was so stark, it almost seemed like a scene from 2 different worlds colliding. Robert's voice carried across the entrance hall, sharp and dismissive. I couldn't hear exactly what he was saying, but his body language spoke volumes. The boy was saying something, his lips moving rapidly, his small hands gesturing with an urgency that seemed desperate. For a moment, just a brief, flickering moment, I felt something stir in my chest. A whisper of compassion, a tiny voice asking me if I should intervene. But then my training kicked in. The rules and regulations that had been hammered into my consciousness over 3 years of employment. Le Chateau had a strict dress code, not just for staff but for guests as well. No shoes, no service. It was printed right there on a small brass plaque by the door, a policy that Mrs. Hendricks enforced without exception. I had seen her turn away celebrities who showed up in casual attire, businessmen who forgot their jackets, even a local politician's wife who wore sandals deemed inappropriate for our establishment. The rules were the rules, and they existed for a reason, to maintain the exclusive atmosphere that our clientele paid premium prices to enjoy. So when Robert finally gave up trying to reason with the child and called me over with a sharp gesture, I knew exactly what was expected of me. I approached the entrance with confident strides, my professional mask firmly in place, ready to handle the situation with the efficiency that had earned me Employee of the Month twice in the past year. Up close, the boy looked even more disheveled than I had initially thought. His face was smudged with dirt, and there were tear tracks running down his cheeks, cutting clean lines through the grime. His eyes, though, that's what I remember most vividly. They were large and brown, filled with a desperation that seemed far too profound for someone so young, like he was carrying the weight of the entire world on his small shoulders. When he looked at me, I saw hope flicker in those eyes, a belief that maybe I would be different, that maybe I would listen to what Robert had dismissed. He opened his mouth to speak, his voice cracking with emotion, but I raised my hand to stop him before he could get the words out. I didn't want to hear his story, Didn't want to know why he was there or what had brought a shoeless child to the doorstep of the city's most expensive restaurant. Because hearing his story would make it harder to do what I knew I had to do, would make the guilt that was already beginning to gnaw at the edges of my consciousness grow into something I couldn't ignore. So I cut him off, my voice professional but firm, the same tone I used when explaining to customers that we were fully booked, or that a particular wine was no longer available. I told him that Le Chateau had a strict dress code, that we couldn't allow anyone without proper footwear to enter the premises, and that he would need to leave immediately. The words came out smooth and practiced, a script I had delivered countless times before to people who didn't meet our standards, though never to a child, never to someone who looked so utterly desperate and alone. As I spoke, I watched the hope in his eyes die, slowly extinguishing like a candle flame starved of oxygen. His shoulders slumped, his small body seeming to collapse in on itself, and fresh tears began to stream down his face. He tried one more time to speak, to explain, his voice rising with urgency, but I was already stepping back, already turning away, already closing the door on whatever he had come there to say. Robert placed a firm hand on the boy's shoulder, guiding him back toward the street with practiced efficiency, and I returned to the dining room, pushing the encounter to the back of my mind as I picked up a tray of entrees that needed to be delivered to table 7. But something was different now. Something had shifted in the air around me even though I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. The other waiters were whispering among themselves, shooting glances toward the entrance, and some of the customers near the windows were craning their necks to see what was happening outside. I tried to focus on my work, moving from table to table with mechanical precision, refilling water glasses, taking orders, clearing plates, but my mind kept drifting back to those brown eyes filled with desperation, to the cuts on those bare feet, to the urgency in that small voice I had refused to hear. Something felt wrong, deeply wrong, like I had just made a terrible mistake but couldn't yet see the full scope of its consequences. The dining room seemed too bright suddenly, the laughter of the wealthy patrons too loud, the clinking of silverware against fine china, almost mocking in its casual indifference to the suffering that existed just beyond our frosted glass doors. I was delivering dessert menus to a couple celebrating their anniversary when I heard it, the sound that would mark the moment everything changed. The kitchen doors burst open with a bang that made everyone in the restaurant jump, and Mrs. Hendricks came rushing out, her usually composed face flushed with color, her eyes wide with something that looked like panic mixed with recognition. She was moving faster than I had ever seen her move, practically running across the dining room in her designer heels, heading straight for the entrance where Robert was just returning from having escorted the boy away. I watched, frozen in place with the dessert menus still clutched in my hands as she grabbed Robert by the arm and said something to him in a voice too low for me to hear, but urgent enough that his face went pale. Then they both rushed outside, pushing through the glass doors into the early evening air, and I saw Mrs. Hendricks looking up and down the street frantically, her head swiveling back and forth like she was searching for something precious that had been lost. The entire restaurant had gone quiet now. All conversation stopped. Every eye turned toward the unfolding drama at the entrance. I set down the menus and moved closer, drawn by a force I couldn't resist, my heart beginning to pound in my chest with a rhythm that felt like dread, mixed with anticipation. Through the glass doors, I could see Mrs. Hendricks had found the boy, had caught up with him about half a block away where he was sitting on the curb, his small body hunched over, shoulders shaking with sobs. She knelt down beside him, not caring that her expensive skirt was touching the dirty sidewalk, and placed her hands on his shoulders. Even from where I stood, I could see her face transform, the usual stern mask of professional authority melting away to reveal raw emotion that I had never witnessed in all my years working under her supervision. She was crying, actual tears streaming down her face, as she pulled the boy into an embrace that seemed to contain years of pain and longing. Then she stood, taking his hand gently in hers, and led him back toward the restaurant. And I finally saw Robert's face clearly, saw the shame and horror written across his aristocratic features as he held the door open for them. Mrs. Hendricks walked through that entrance like she was bringing home something infinitely precious, her arm protectively around the boy's thin shoulders, her eyes sweeping across the dining room until they landed on me, and in that gaze, I saw accusation, disappointment, and a deep sadness that made my stomach turn to ice. She walked right up to me, still holding the boy close, and said in a voice that carried across the now silent restaurant, a voice that trembled with barely controlled emotion. "This is Michael. Michael Hartley. He's the son of our former head chef, Thomas Hartley, who died 6 months ago trying to save a woman from a burning building 2 blocks from here. He's a hero. And his son, this boy right here, has been trying to tell you that his mother collapsed at home, and he ran here for help because this was the only place he could think of, the place where his father worked, the place he considered his second home." The words hit me like physical blows, each one landing with devastating accuracy, and suddenly the dining room was spinning around me, the chandeliers blurring into streaks of light, the faces of the staring patrons melting into a sea of judgment. I had turned away a child in desperate need, had refused to listen to his plea for help, had enforced a dress code while his mother was potentially dying, had chosen policy over humanity, rules over compassion, and the weight of that realization crashed down on me with such force that I actually stumbled backward, my hand reaching for the nearest table to steady myself. Mrs. Hendricks was already on her phone, calling an ambulance, giving the address that Michael choked out between sobs, his small body shaking with the trauma of everything he had been through that evening, running through city streets without shoes because there hadn't been time to find them, because every second counted when your mother is on the floor not responding, because sometimes desperation strips away everything, except the raw need for help. I stood there rooted to the spot, unable to move or speak, watching as one of the other waiters brought out a chair for Michael, as someone else brought him water and a napkin to wipe his face. As the entire staff mobilized around this child I had turned away, offering comfort and support that should have been given the moment he walked through our doors. The ambulance arrived quickly, sirens wailing in the distance before pulling up in front of Le Chateau, and Mrs. Hendricks went with Michael, climbing into the back of the vehicle without a second thought for the restaurant she was leaving behind in the middle of dinner service. Before the doors closed, she looked back at me one more time, and I saw in her eyes not anger, but a profound disappointment that cut deeper than any reprimand could have. She didn't need to say anything else because the message was clear. I had failed. Failed in the most fundamental way possible. Failed to see past the surface to the humanity underneath. Failed to recognize that sometimes the rules we follow so diligently are nothing compared to the basic human duty of compassion and care. The restaurant remained in stunned silence for several minutes after they left, and then slowly, awkwardly, conversations resumed, though they were muted now, subdued, as if everyone present had just witnessed something that made their expensive meals taste a little less satisfying. I went through the motions of finishing my shift, but I was moving like a robot, my body on autopilot, while my mind replayed the scene over and over, each replay adding new layers of shame and regret. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Michael's face, saw the hope dying in his eyes when I turned him away, heard his voice trying to speak words I hadn't let him say, felt the weight of my choice pressing down on me like a physical burden. When my shift finally ended, I couldn't go home, couldn't face the empty silence of my apartment where I would have nothing to do but think about what I had done. Instead, I walked, wandering through the city streets as the night deepened around me, past closed shops and busy bars, past homeless people sleeping in doorways that I had walked past 1,000 times before without really seeing them, past children playing in parks under the watchful eyes of their parents, children who had homes and safety and shoes on their feet. The city looked different to me now, like a veil had been lifted from my eyes, revealing layers of human struggle and pain that I had trained myself not to see, had deliberately blinded myself to in pursuit of professional excellence and personal advancement. How many times had I walked past people in need, I wondered? How many opportunities for compassion had I missed because they didn't fit into the neat categories of my carefully constructed world? The questions haunted me through the long night, each one an accusation, each one a mirror reflecting back a version of myself I didn't want to acknowledge, but could no longer ignore. I found myself standing outside the hospital where they had taken Michael and his mother, staring up at the lit windows, wondering which room they were in, wondering if his mother was okay, wondering if Michael hated me for what I had done, for the precious minutes I had cost him with my rigid adherence to policy over humanity. A security guard eventually asked me to move along, probably thinking I was some kind of vagrant loitering on hospital property, and the irony of that wasn't lost on me, being judged by my appearance and circumstances just as I had judged Michael by his. I wanted to go inside, wanted to find them and apologize, wanted to explain that I wasn't usually like this, that I was a good person who had made a terrible mistake, But what explanation could possibly justify what I had done? What words could erase the memory of turning away a desperate child in need? So I walked away, returning to my apartment as dawn began to break over the city, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed too beautiful for how I felt inside, too hopeful for the darkness that had settled into my soul. I called in sick to work the next day, unable to face the restaurant, unable to put on my crisp white shirt and act like nothing had changed when everything had changed. Mrs. Hendricks called me in the afternoon, her voice tired but relieved as she told me that Michael's mother was going to be okay, that she had suffered a severe diabetic episode and would have died if the ambulance hadn't arrived when it did, that Michael's quick thinking and desperate run for help had saved her life despite my best efforts to prevent him from getting that help. She didn't say that last part directly, but it hung in the air between us, an unspoken accusation that I felt more keenly than any direct criticism could have delivered. She asked me to come to the restaurant the following day for a meeting, and I agreed, knowing that this conversation would determine whether I still had a job, knowing that I wasn't sure I deserved to keep it after what had happened. That night I barely slept, tossing and turning as my mind replayed every detail of that evening, examining each moment where I could have made a different choice, could have listened instead of dismissing, could have seen a child in need instead of a violation of dress code. When I arrived at Le Chateau the next morning, the restaurant was closed, the dining room empty and quiet without the usual bustle of preparation for evening service. Mrs. Hendricks was waiting for me at a corner table, 2 cups of coffee already poured, and she gestured for me to sit across from her. The silence stretched between us for a long moment, heavy with unspoken words, until finally she began to speak, her voice softer than I had ever heard it, lacking the usual crisp authority that defined her management style. She told me about Thomas Hartley, about how he had started as a line cook at Le Chateau 15 years ago and worked his way up to head chef, about how his passion for food was matched only by his love for his family, about the day 6 months ago when he ran into a burning apartment building to save a stranger and never came out. She told me about the memorial service they had held right there in the restaurant, about how Michael and his mother had stood surrounded by the entire staff, about how she had promised them that Le Chateau would always be there for them, that they would always have a family here, a promise that I had unknowingly broken with my rigid adherence to policy. As she spoke, tears began to roll down my cheeks, hot and shameful, and I made no effort to wipe them away because I deserved to feel every ounce of this pain, deserved to sit with the discomfort of my actions and their consequences. Mrs. Hendricks reached across the table and placed her hand over mine, a gesture of comfort I hadn't expected and didn't feel I had earned. She told me that she understood how it happened, how easy it is to let rules and policies become more important than people, how the daily grind of maintaining standards can make us forget why those standards exist in the first place, which is to create a space where people can experience joy and connection and celebration, not to exclude those who need help or compassion. She said that she had made similar mistakes in her own career, times when she had prioritized procedure over humanity, times when she had enforced rules without considering the context or circumstances, and that she had learned, painfully and slowly, that true excellence in service isn't about perfect execution of policy, but about recognizing the humanity in every person who walks through your door. Have you ever had someone show you grace when you didn't deserve it? Extend compassion when you expected judgment? That's what Mrs. Hendricks did for me in that moment, and it broke something open inside me that I didn't even know was closed. She didn't fire me, didn't write me up, didn't add this incident to my permanent record. Instead, she gave me a choice. I could continue working at Le Chateau with the same approach I had always taken, following rules and maintaining standards with rigid precision, or I could choose to transform this painful experience into a catalyst for change, to use this moment as an opportunity to become not just a better waiter, but a better human being. The choice seemed obvious, but making it real, actually changing the patterns of thinking and behavior that had been ingrained in me for years, that would be the real challenge. She told me that Michael and his mother wanted to meet with me, that despite everything, they didn't harbor anger or resentment, that they understood I was just doing my job as I understood it, but that they wanted to talk, to share their story more fully, to help me understand the impact of what had happened from their perspective. The thought of facing them terrified me. Confronting the human cost of my actions felt almost unbearable, but I knew I had to do it. Knew that avoiding that discomfort would be just another way of choosing convenience over growth, policy over humanity. Comment below if you've ever had to face the consequences of a decision you regretted, because I promise you, understanding that feeling will make this next part of the story even more powerful. The meeting was arranged for the following week, giving Michael's mother time to recover enough to leave the hospital. And those days of waiting were some of the longest of my life, each hour stretching out as I imagined 1,000 different versions of how the conversation might go, what I might say, how I could possibly express the depth of my remorse and the magnitude of my changed perspective. When the day finally arrived, I got to Le Chateau 2 hours early, my stomach in knots, my hands shaking slightly as I arranged and rearranged the chairs around the table where we would meet. Mrs. Hendricks had closed the restaurant for the afternoon, giving us privacy for this conversation, and the empty dining room felt vast and echoing, every sound amplified by the absence of the usual crowd. I had spent the previous night writing and rewriting what I wanted to say, trying to find words adequate to express my apology, but every version felt hollow and insufficient, mere sounds that could never bridge the gap between my actions and their impact. When they arrived, Michael walking beside his mother as she moved slowly, still recovering from her ordeal, I felt my carefully prepared words dissolve into nothing, leaving me standing there mute and ashamed, unable to meet their eyes. Michael's mother, Sarah Hartley, was a thin woman with kind eyes that looked tired beyond her years, wearing a simple dress and, I noticed with a pang of recognition, worn shoes that had seen better days. Michael stood close to her side, protective in a way that seemed far too mature for his young age, his hand clasping hers tightly as if afraid to let go. Mrs. Hendricks made the introductions, her voice gentle, and then excused herself to give us privacy, though I could see her watching from the kitchen window, ready to intervene if needed. Sarah gestured for me to sit, and we all settled around the table, an awkward silence filling the space between us until she finally broke it with words I hadn't expected to hear. She thanked me for meeting with them, her voice soft but steady, and said that she didn't come to make me feel worse but to help me understand, to share their story so that maybe, hopefully, something positive could come from this painful experience. She told me about Thomas, about the man who had been her husband and Michael's father, about his dreams and his laughter, and his unwavering belief that food could bring people together across all divides of class, race, and circumstance. She told me about the day he died, how he had been walking home from work when he saw smoke pouring from an apartment building, how he had run inside without hesitation because someone was screaming for help, how he had saved a woman's life but lost his own when the ceiling collapsed. She told me about the months that followed, the grief and the financial struggle, how Thomas had been their family's sole provider, and how his death had left them drowning in bills and debt, how she had been working 3 jobs to try to keep their small apartment while managing her diabetes on medication she could barely afford. Her voice cracked as she described the day of her collapse, how she had felt the warning signs but had pushed through because she had to get Michael fed and ready for bed, how she had suddenly found herself on the floor unable to move or speak, watching helplessly as Michael's face appeared above hers, his eyes wide with terror. She told me how he had tried to call 911, but their phone had been disconnected for non-payment, how he had run to neighbors who weren't home, how in his panic and desperation he had remembered Le Chateau, remembered the place his father had loved, remembered that his father had always said the people there were like family, and had run the 15 blocks without stopping, without even thinking to put on shoes, driven purely by the need to save his mother's life. As she spoke, Michael sat silently beside her, his eyes fixed on the table, and I could see him reliving that terrifying evening, see his small body tense with the memory of that desperate run through city streets, that frantic need to find help before it was too late. Sarah reached over and placed her hand over his, a gesture of comfort and connection, before turning her gaze back to me, and what I saw in her eyes wasn't anger or accusation, but a profound sadness mixed with something that looked almost like compassion. She told me that she didn't blame me for what happened, that she understood I was following rules, doing my job, maintaining the standards of an establishment that prided itself on excellence, but she wanted me to understand something crucial about those rules and standards. They should serve humanity, not override it. She said that policies and procedures are important, they create order and consistency and quality, but they should never become more important than recognizing when a human being is in crisis, when compassion and flexibility are required, when the right thing to do is to break the rules rather than hide behind them. Her words sank into me like stones dropping into still water, creating ripples that spread outward, touching parts of my understanding I hadn't even known existed. She wasn't trying to make me feel guilty, though guilt was certainly what I felt. She was trying to teach me something essential about what it means to truly serve others, to recognize that excellence isn't about perfect adherence to standards, but about responding appropriately to the unique needs of each moment and each person. Michael finally spoke then, his voice small but clear, telling me about his father, about how Thomas had taught him that cooking wasn't just about following recipes, but about understanding that food was a way of showing love and care, that every meal prepared with attention and heart was a gift to the person receiving it. He said his father had always talked about Le Chateau not as a place of exclusivity, but as a place of excellence in service, where making people feel valued and cared for was more important than anything else. The pain in his voice when he said that he had run to Le Chateau because he believed it was a place where people cared, where he would find help and compassion just as his father had always promised, cut through me like a blade, sharp and precise, leaving wounds that I knew would take a long time to heal. I finally found my voice, though it came out rough and unsteady, thick with emotion I was no longer trying to suppress. I apologized, not with the formal professional apology I had practiced, but with raw honesty, telling them that there was no excuse for what I had done, no justification that could make it right, but that I wanted them to know their story had fundamentally changed me, had forced me to examine not just my actions that evening, but the entire framework of values and priorities that had led me to make such a terrible choice. I told them about my journey over the past week, the sleepless nights and painful self-reflection, the recognition of how many times I had probably made smaller versions of the same mistake, choosing convenience over compassion, policy over humanity, personal comfort over the discomfort of truly seeing and responding to others' needs. I told them that I couldn't undo what had happened, couldn't erase those terrifying minutes when Michael was being turned away while his mother's life hung in the balance, but that I could promise them, and promise myself, that I would never make that mistake again, that every person who walked through the doors of Le Chateau, regardless of their appearance or circumstances, would be seen first as a human being worthy of dignity and respect, and only second as a customer subject to policies and procedures. Sarah smiled then, a small, sad smile that held both forgiveness and acknowledgement of the long road ahead, and she said something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. She said that Thomas would have appreciated this conversation, would have seen it as an opportunity for growth and transformation, would have believed that mistakes, however painful, are only truly failures if we refuse to learn from them. She said that the best way I could honor his memory wasn't to drown in guilt, but to use this experience to become someone who makes the world a little more compassionate, a little more humane, one interaction at a time. Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, extending his hand toward me across the table, and when he opened his fist, I saw a small pin, the kind that staff at Le Chateau wore, with the restaurant's logo engraved on brass. He said his father had given it to him years ago, had told him it represented not just a job but a commitment to serving others with excellence and heart, and that he wanted me to have it, to keep it as a reminder of why we do what we do, of the responsibility that comes with being in a position to help others. I took the pin with trembling hands, feeling the weight of it far exceeded its physical mass, feeling like I was being trusted with something sacred, a symbol of values I had lost sight of but was being given a chance to reclaim. We talked for another hour, sharing stories and tears, building a bridge across the chasm that my actions had created, and by the time they left, something had fundamentally shifted in me, a reorientation of my internal compass from one that pointed toward rules and success to one that pointed toward humanity and service in its truest sense. Do you know what it feels like to be given a second chance you don't deserve? Share your experiences in the comments because this kind of grace is rare and precious, and recognizing it can change everything. The weeks that followed were a period of profound transformation for me, both internally and in how I approached my work at Le Chateau. I kept Michael's pin in my pocket every shift, my fingers finding it whenever I faced a situation that required a decision between policy and compassion, between convenience and caring. Mrs. Hendricks noticed the change in me immediately, saw it in how I greeted every person who walked through our doors with genuine attention and care, how I took time to really listen when customers spoke to me, how I looked for opportunities to go beyond the basic requirements of my job to make someone's experience special. She began giving me more responsibility, not just in terms of tables and service, but in training new staff, teaching them the philosophy that she and I had both learned through painful experience, that excellence in hospitality isn't about perfection in execution, but about recognizing and responding to the humanity of every person we serve. I started volunteering at a soup kitchen on my days off, serving meals to people experiencing homelessness, people who society often treats as invisible, and every time I placed a plate of food in front of someone, I thought about Michael's bare feet and desperate eyes, about how easily any of us could find ourselves in circumstances beyond our control, in need of compassion and help, rather than judgment and dismissal. The experience humbled me in ways I couldn't have anticipated, stripped away layers of pride and assumption I hadn't even known I was carrying, taught me to see past surface appearances to the complex human stories underneath. At the soup kitchen, I met a man named Robert, coincidentally sharing a name with our maitre d' at Le Chateau, who had been a successful architect before a series of medical emergencies, and bad luck had left him homeless. Talking with him, hearing his story, I realized how thin the line is between stability and crisis, how quickly circumstances can change, how wrong I had been to make assumptions about people based on their appearance or situation. He told me that the hardest part of being homeless wasn't the physical hardship, but the way people looked through him rather than at him, the way he had become invisible to the society he had once been a productive member of, and his words echoed in my mind every time I returned to my job at Le Chateau, reminding me never to let someone become invisible to me again. Sarah and Michael became regular visitors to the restaurant, coming in every few weeks for dinner, always treated like the family they were, always welcomed with open arms and genuine joy by the entire staff. Watching Michael's face light up when he walked through those doors, seeing him feel safe and valued in a place that had once turned him away, brought me both joy and a continuing reminder of the stakes involved in every interaction, every decision, every moment when we choose how to respond to another human being. Mrs. Hendricks established a new policy at Le Chateau, one that she had made in consultation with me and the rest of the staff, stating explicitly that while we maintained our standards of excellence, those standards would never again override basic human compassion and care. We created a discretionary fund that could be used to help staff members or community members in crisis, named the Thomas Hartley Emergency Fund, in honor of Michael's father, and every time we contributed to it or used it to help someone in need, I felt like we were honoring not just Thomas's memory but the lesson his son had taught us all about the real meaning of service. The restaurant began to change in subtle ways, becoming not just a place of fine dining, but a place known in the community for genuine hospitality, for treating every person with dignity regardless of their circumstances. We still maintained our high standards, still served exquisite food on fine china under glittering chandeliers, but there was a warmth now that hadn't existed before, a recognition that true excellence includes compassion as an essential ingredient. Our reputation grew, not despite this change but because of it, as word spread about a restaurant that didn't just serve food but served humanity, that understood service meant seeing and valuing every person who walked through the door. I received a promotion 6 months after the incident with Michael, not because I had become better at following rules, but because I had become better at recognizing when rules needed to be bent or broken in service of something more important. My relationship with Michael and Sarah deepened over time, evolving from awkward apology to genuine friendship, built on the foundation of shared growth and mutual understanding. Michael started visiting the restaurant after school sometimes, doing his homework at a corner table while the staff prepared for evening service, and I found myself looking forward to those visits, to conversations with this wise young soul who had been forced to grow up too fast, but had somehow maintained a generous spirit despite all he had been through. He told me once that his father used to say that the measure of a person wasn't whether they made mistakes but what they did after making them, whether they used the experience to become bitter or better, and those words became another compass point for me, another reminder that transformation is always possible if we're willing to do the hard work of change. Sarah recovered slowly, but steadily, getting her diabetes under control with better medication access facilitated by connections Mrs. Hendricks made with local healthcare providers. She eventually found a better job with regular hours and decent pay, allowing her to spend more time with Michael and to begin rebuilding the stability that Thomas's death had shattered. Watching her journey of recovery and resilience taught me yet another lesson about the strength that exists in people we might otherwise overlook, the incredible capacity humans have to endure and overcome when given even a small amount of support and recognition. On the anniversary of that fateful evening, Mrs. Hendricks organized a special dinner at Le Chateau, closing the restaurant to regular customers, and instead hosting a gathering for Sarah, Michael, our entire staff, and the woman Thomas had died, saving from the burning building. It was an evening of tears and laughter, of stories shared about a man who had touched so many lives, of recognition that his legacy lived on, not just in his son, but in the changed hearts and practices of everyone present. During the dinner, Mrs. Hendricks gave a speech about Thomas, about his passion for food and people, about his belief that a restaurant should be more than just a business, but a place of community and connection. And as she spoke, I saw Michael holding his mother's hand, tears streaming down both their faces, but their tears were mixed with smiles because they felt Thomas's presence in that room, felt his values being honored and continued. The woman Thomas had saved, an elderly lady named Grace, spoke about how she thought of him every day, how his sacrifice had given her the chance to see her grandchildren grow up, to be present for birthdays and graduations and all the small moments that make up a life. And her gratitude reminded all of us that heroism isn't just about the dramatic moment of sacrifice, but about all the ripples that flow outward from that moment, touching countless lives in ways we can't always predict or measure. After dinner, Michael pulled me aside and gave me something wrapped in tissue paper, carefully folded and tied with string, and when I unwrapped it, I found a photograph of Thomas in his chef's whites, standing in the kitchen of Le Chateau, his face lit up with joy and pride. And on the back, Sarah had written, "Thank you for honoring his memory by learning to see what he always saw, the humanity in everyone." I keep that photograph on my bedside table now, the first thing I see every morning and the last thing I see every night, a constant reminder of the man I never met but who changed my life through his son, through his legacy, through the painful lesson his family taught me about what really matters. My transformation didn't happen overnight. And it wasn't a smooth or easy process, but it was real and lasting, a fundamental rewiring of how I moved through the world and how I understood my role in other people's lives. I began to see my job not as a waiter, but as someone in a position of small but significant power, power to make someone's day better or worse, to see them or ignore them, to extend compassion or withhold it, and I committed myself to using that power responsibly, thoughtfully, with constant attention to the humanity of every person I encountered. There were still moments when I caught myself starting to judge based on appearance, starting to let policy override compassion, but now I had tools to recognize those moments and choose differently, to pause and really look at the person in front of me, to remember Michael's bare feet and desperate eyes, to ask myself what Thomas would do in this situation. The impact of that evening extended far beyond my personal transformation, creating ripples through the entire restaurant and even into the broader community. Other staff members who had witnessed what happened began their own journeys of reflection and change, examining their own assumptions and biases, questioning policies they had followed without thought. We started having staff meetings where we discussed not just operational issues but philosophical ones, talking about what service really means, how we can balance standards with compassion, what our responsibility is to the community beyond just providing excellent food and ambiance. These conversations weren't always comfortable. Sometimes they exposed biases and blind spots we didn't want to acknowledge, but they were necessary and valuable, pushing all of us to grow beyond our comfort zones. Mrs. Hendricks became something of a mentor to me during this period, sharing stories from her own career, times when she had made mistakes similar to mine, times when she had learned hard lessons about the difference between being professional and being humane. She told me about an incident early in her management career, when she had fired a staff member for repeated lateness, without taking the time to understand that the employee was caring for a sick parent and struggling to balance work with family responsibilities, how she had later learned that her rigid enforcement of policy had contributed to a crisis that might have been prevented with a little flexibility and compassion. Her willingness to share her own failures and growth helped me understand that the path to becoming truly excellent in service is paved with mistakes and learning, that perfection isn't the goal, but rather constant improvement and increasing consciousness. I started reading books about hospitality and service, not just the technical manuals about wine pairing and table setting, but philosophical works about what it means to serve others, to recognize their dignity, to create spaces where people feel valued and seen. One book in particular, about the spiritual dimensions of service work, talked about how every interaction with another human being is an opportunity to either build them up or tear them down, to recognize the divine spark in them or to diminish it. And that framing transformed how I understood even the smallest exchanges. The brief moment of eye contact when taking an order, the tone of voice when answering a question, the quality of attention given when listening to a customer's needs. These weren't just mechanical aspects of doing my job, but sacred opportunities to affirm someone's worth and humanity. An understanding that made every shift feel less like work and more like a calling. Sarah told me once that Thomas had felt the same way about cooking, that he saw preparing food not as just a technical skill, but as an act of love and care, a way of nourishing not just bodies, but souls. And hearing that helped me understand why Michael had been so certain that Le Chateau would help him, why he had believed that his father's values were embodied in the place where he had worked. Thomas had tried to infuse every dish he made with that philosophy of care and connection, and my job now was to ensure that philosophy extended to every aspect of the restaurant's operation, from how we greeted guests at the door to how we said goodbye when they left. The changes we made at Le Chateau began to attract attention from other restaurants and hospitality businesses in the city, with managers and owners calling Mrs. Hendricks to ask about our approach, curious about how we had managed to maintain our high standards and exclusive atmosphere, while also becoming known for compassionate, inclusive service. She started giving talks at industry conferences, always bringing me along, having me share the story of Michael and that terrible evening when I turned him away, using my failure as a teaching tool to help others avoid making similar mistakes. It was humbling and sometimes painful to stand in front of rooms full of hospitality professionals and recount my worst moment, to see the recognition in their eyes that they too might have done the same thing in similar circumstances. But it was also healing, transforming my shame into something purposeful, using my mistake to potentially prevent countless others. Comment on this video if you've ever had an experience that completely changed your perspective on your work or your life, because understanding that we all have these transformative moments helps us recognize their value when they occur. Michael graduated from elementary school 2 years after that fateful evening, and I attended his graduation ceremony along with Sarah and Mrs. Hendricks, watching him walk across the stage to receive his diploma. This brave young boy who had run through city streets without shoes to save his mother's life, who had faced rejection and kept pushing, who had somehow maintained faith in human goodness despite having every reason to lose it. In his graduation speech, he talked about his father, about the lessons Thomas had taught him about caring for others, about using whatever talents and opportunities you have to make the world a little better. And I sat there crying openly, not caring who saw, because I was witnessing the embodiment of resilience and grace. Watching a child who had every right to be bitter and angry instead choosing to honor his father's memory by spreading the same values of compassion and service that Thomas had lived by. After the ceremony, Michael found me in the crowd and gave me a hug, thanking me for being part of his journey, and I realized with sudden clarity that this young boy didn't see me as the person who had failed him, but as someone who had learned from that failure, who had allowed that painful experience to transform them into someone better. His forgiveness and acceptance, freely given without any demand or expectation, was one of the greatest gifts I have ever received, a reminder that humans have an incredible capacity for grace, if we're willing to receive it. The Thomas Hartley Emergency Fund that we established at Le Chateau has helped dozens of people over the years, staff members facing medical crises or family emergencies, community members who needed a helping hand to get through a difficult period, students who needed support to pursue hospitality careers. Every time we write a check from that fund or provide assistance in Thomas's name, I think about the man I never met but whose impact on my life has been immeasurable, whose death in service of saving another person's life taught me through his son about what real service means. The fund has become more than just a practical resource but a living memorial, a way of ensuring that Thomas's values continue to make a difference in the world long after his death, and I'm proud to be part of maintaining and growing that legacy. My own career has continued to evolve, and I eventually moved into a management role at Le Chateau, taking on some of the responsibilities that Mrs. Hendricks used to handle, though she remains involved as an owner and mentor, always available when I need guidance or wisdom. In my new role, I've made it a priority to train every new staff member in the philosophy of compassionate service, telling them Michael's story during their orientation, making sure they understand that policies and standards are important, but must always serve the larger goal of recognizing and honoring the humanity of every person who walks through our doors. Some new employees think I'm being overly sentimental or impractical, preferring to focus on the technical aspects of service, but I've found that those who really grasp this philosophy become not just better workers, but better human beings, carrying these lessons beyond the restaurant into every aspect of their lives. I've stayed in touch with some former employees who have moved on to other restaurants or careers, and several have told me that what they learned at Le Chateau about seeing people, really seeing them, has transformed how they move through the world, making them more attentive partners, more patient parents, more engaged citizens. Hearing these stories reminds me that the ripples from that evening with Michael continue to spread outward in ways I can't fully track or measure, touching lives I'll never know about, creating a cascade of small moments of compassion and recognition that make the world incrementally better. That's what I've learned most profoundly from this entire experience, that every action we take, every choice we make about how to treat another human being, has consequences that extend far beyond the immediate moment, creating ripples that spread outward in patterns too complex to fully comprehend. The 5 minutes I spent turning Michael away could have cost his mother her life, could have traumatized a young boy beyond repair, could have broken the promise that our restaurant had made to a fallen hero's family. But instead, through grace and forgiveness and the hard work of transformation, those 5 minutes became the catalyst for changes that have touched hundreds of lives in positive ways. I don't say this to minimize what I did wrong or to suggest that everything worked out fine so my mistake doesn't matter, because it does matter. It will always matter, and I will carry the weight of those moments for the rest of my life. But I do say it to illustrate that mistakes, however grave, don't have to be the end of the story, that we always have the opportunity to learn and grow and change, to use our failures as foundations for becoming better versions of ourselves. Looking back now, more than 3 years after that evening, I can see the person I was before Michael walked through those doors, confident in my professionalism, proud of my ability to maintain standards, convinced that excellence meant perfect adherence to rules and policies, and I barely recognize him. That person wasn't evil or malicious, he was just blind, operating with a narrow vision of what service meant, unable to see past the surface to the humanity underneath, and it took the desperate eyes of a shoeless child to finally open his eyes to a deeper truth. I'm grateful for that wake-up call, even though I wish it hadn't required someone else's suffering to deliver it. Wish I could have learned these lessons through reflection and study, rather than through the painful consequences of my own failure. But life doesn't always offer us the luxury of learning easy lessons. Sometimes the most important transformations come through crisis and conflict, through having our assumptions challenged and our certainties shattered, through being forced to confront the gap between who we think we are and who we actually are in moments of pressure. Michael is in high school now, a thoughtful young man who volunteers at the soup kitchen where I also work, who has already decided he wants to pursue a career in hospitality, carrying on his father's legacy in a new generation. And when I watch him interact with people, I see Thomas's values alive in him, see the same commitment to dignity and service that defined his father's life. He's told me that he wants to open his own restaurant someday, a place that combines excellent food with radical inclusivity, where anyone, regardless of their circumstances or appearance, would feel welcomed and valued, where the standards of excellence would never override the basic commitment to human dignity. I have no doubt he'll achieve that dream, and when he does, I want to be there to support him, to help him build something that honors his father's memory while also creating a new model of what hospitality can be. Sarah is doing well, working now as an advocate for people with diabetes, using her own experience of nearly dying from a diabetic episode to help others navigate the healthcare system and access the resources they need to manage their condition effectively. She's told me that one of the most valuable things that came from her crisis was the recognition of how many people face similar struggles in silence, how many families are one emergency away from catastrophe because of inadequate healthcare access and financial instability, and she's made it her mission to try to change that, to advocate for better systems and support, to ensure that others don't have to endure what she and Michael went through. Her work has inspired me to get involved in advocacy as well, using my platform in the restaurant industry to push for better working conditions and wages for service workers, to challenge the systems that keep people trapped in cycles of poverty and vulnerability, to recognize that individual acts of compassion, while important, must be coupled with efforts to change the structures that make such desperate situations possible in the first place. The story of that evening has been featured in local media a few times, with reporters wanting to write about the boy who ran shoeless through city streets to save his mother, the restaurant that failed him initially, but then became a champion of compassionate service, the waiter who learned a hard lesson and devoted himself to transformation. Each time I'm interviewed, I try to emphasize not my redemption, but the ongoing nature of growth. The fact that learning to truly see and serve others isn't a destination you reach, but a practice you commit to daily, requiring constant attention and effort and willingness to examine your own biases and assumptions. I don't want people to hear this story and think, "What a nice ending, everything worked out fine," because that misses the point entirely. The point being that we all have opportunities every single day to either honor or diminish the humanity of the people around us. And we have to choose consciously, deliberately, with full awareness of the stakes involved, because those choices matter more than we usually realize. So here I am, more than 3 years later, still working at Le Chateau, still carrying Michael's pin in my pocket and Thomas's photograph on my bedside table, still learning and growing and trying to live up to the grace I was shown when I deserved condemnation. I'm not perfect, I still make mistakes, still sometimes find myself starting to judge before I remember to really see. But now I have tools and awareness and commitment to doing better, and that makes all the difference. Now I want to talk directly to you, whoever you are watching this video, because this story isn't just about me or Michael or Le Chateau, it's about all of us, about the choices we make every day and how we treat the people around us. Have you ever walked past someone in need without stopping? Have you ever enforced a rule without considering the context or consequences? Have you ever made assumptions about someone based on their appearance? If you answered yes to any of these questions, you're human. You're just like I was, operating on autopilot, following social scripts and institutional policies without always thinking about their human impact. But the question is, what will you do with that recognition? Will you use it as an opportunity to examine your own patterns and biases, to think more carefully about how you move through the world and interact with others? Or will you dismiss it as just another sad story on the internet? Watch the next video and forget everything I've shared with you here. I'm asking you, really asking you from the bottom of my heart, to let this story change you even a little bit, to let it make you more conscious of the power you have in every interaction to either affirm or diminish someone's humanity. Maybe you're not a waiter at an exclusive restaurant. Maybe you'll never be in a position to turn away or help a desperate child. But you have other opportunities, countless opportunities, to choose compassion over convenience, humanity over policy, seeing over judging. The person behind you in line at the grocery store who seems to be taking too long, maybe they're struggling with something you can't see. The coworker who shows up late repeatedly, maybe they're dealing with a crisis you don't know about. The person asking for change on the street corner, maybe they're one bad break away from being you in different circumstances. I'm not saying you have to help everyone or that having boundaries is wrong or that rules never matter. I'm saying that we need to lead with curiosity and compassion rather than judgment and assumption, that we need to really look at people and consider their humanity before we decide how to respond to them. The lesson I learned from Michael, the lesson that cost me so much shame and pain to truly understand, is that every human being deserves to be seen, to be heard, to be treated with basic dignity, regardless of their circumstances or appearance. This isn't a radical idea. It's actually quite simple, but living it consistently requires conscious effort and ongoing commitment, because we're all swimming in a culture that often teaches us to do the opposite, to categorize and judge and dismiss people who don't fit into approved categories. I'm asking you to swim against that current, to be someone who sees past the surface, who asks questions before making judgments, who remembers that everyone has a story and a struggle you might not be able to see. If this story touched you in any way, if it made you think or feel or reconsider how you move through the world, I want you to do 3 things for me. First, leave a comment below sharing your own experience with either being judged unfairly or with learning to see past your own assumptions and judgments. Your story might be the one that touches someone else's heart and inspires their own transformation. And by sharing it, you're contributing to a larger conversation about how we can all become more conscious and compassionate in how we treat each other. Don't be afraid to be vulnerable in your comment. To admit times when you failed to see someone or when someone failed to see you, because that honesty is what creates real connection and understanding. Second, if this story resonated with you, if it taught you something or changed your perspective even a little bit, please hit that like button, because it helps more people find this video. It helps spread this message of compassion and conscious service beyond just you and me, creating ripples that might touch someone who really needs to hear it today. Think of the like button, not just as a way of showing me support, but as a way of amplifying a message that could genuinely make the world a little better, if enough people hear it and take it to heart. And third, please subscribe to Through My Eyes and hit that notification bell, because this channel is dedicated to sharing stories that matter. Stories about real human experiences and the lessons we can learn from them. Stories that challenge us to grow and think and become better versions of ourselves. By subscribing, you're committing to staying engaged with these conversations, to continuing your own journey of growth and awareness, to being part of a community that values compassion and consciousness, and the ongoing work of becoming more fully human. Thank you for staying with me through this entire story, for listening not just with your ears, but with your heart, for being willing to sit with the discomfort of difficult truths and challenging reflections. Thank you for caring enough about Michael and Sarah and Thomas and even about me, a flawed human being who made a terrible mistake but was given grace and the opportunity to transform. And most of all, thank you for being willing to examine your own life and choices, to consider how you might apply these lessons in your own context, to commit to seeing and honoring the humanity in everyone you encounter. That's what makes all of this worthwhile, knowing that these painful experiences and hard-won lessons can ripple outward to touch lives I'll never know about, creating a cascade of small moments of compassion that together can genuinely make the world a better place. So go out there and be someone who sees people, really sees them, who treats everyone with the dignity they deserve, who remembers that behind every face is a complex human story deserving of respect and compassion. Be the person who would have listened to Michael, who would have seen past his bare feet to his desperate need, who would have chosen humanity over policy without a moment's hesitation. Be the change that this world so desperately needs, one interaction at a time, one conscious choice at a time, one moment of true seeing at a time. And remember, you don't have to be perfect, you just have to be committed to trying, to learning from your mistakes, to growing every day into a more conscious and compassionate version of yourself. That's all any of us can do, and it's enough, more than enough, to change the world.